Сегодня мы продолжаем наши открытые семинары и продолжаем их вообще, но в этом году это получается старт. И я рад приветствовать здесь Sshlutera из университета Вены. На самом деле у нас уже было одно собрание, одно мероприятие, посвященное теории, о которой будет говорить Андреас сегодня, теории социальных порядков Норта Лобиса Вайнерса. И нам очень интересно продолжить эту тему, и надеюсь, что будет очень полезно и очень ценно для всех из вас послушать. Очень интересно и полезно послушать еще и потому, что так или иначе практика английского языка, и, возможно, сейчас я скажу последнее слово на русском языке на этом семинаре и передам слово Андреасу.
Спасибо. So, thanks everyone, or thanks Alexei first of all, for the kind words, almost understood. And so my Russian, as I said earlier, is not so really good, so feel free to ask me, even in Russian, but then I need someone to translate it. And yeah, so thanks for coming, even if it's evening and so late. What I want to present today is a paper called The Theory of Social Orders and Great Divergence between New Zealand and Uruguay after 1930. This paper is part of my, or is an extract of my PhD thesis, which I wrote at the University of Vienna. And it was later published as a book, so you can maybe have a look in it later on. You might wonder why I'm here and what's the relation to Russia and so on, but I come to this later. And so I would start with the agenda for today. But first I want to talk about the motivation, what is behind, and then maybe you also understand maybe why it's maybe interesting for you with a Russian background or with a Russian focus. And then maybe you do not have all these theoretical backgrounds, so I give you some idea what is behind the research agenda of this. I talk about a bit about the methodology. Then of course I present the findings of this particular chapter of my thesis. I get to some conclusion, and then hopefully, last but not least, we have a good discussion on saying maybe you have examples from Russia and so on, or your own studies, or maybe you have an idea how to use these ideas for your own research. So let's start with the motivation behind this. Basically, my general research idea or research interest is about the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence is this one you see here on the right-hand side. Is this unique event in history where we see some countries remaining at the same level of output on the red scale, and you see others in the last 200 years getting up to 100 or 200 times richer than other countries. So this is a unique phenomena in history, and so the question is always behind why it actually happened, what were the key factors for this development. So especially for my purpose or for my part of the studies, I'm more interested in the impact of institutions, formal and informal institutions, on economic development, and here as well with the so-called New World economies. So New World economies are the far-away economies in South America, in Oceania, and so this kind of economies. So from the theoretical background, it's related within the works of Acemoglu, Douglas North, Engelman and Sokolov, Rodrik, Mansour Olsen. I think you've heard about these names. But I also have a bit of old institutional background, so the guys who studied this 100 and 150 years ago. So it's a bit of a mix. But anyway, So what came up with my research question, whether the theory by North, Wallace and Weingast can explain the development of New Zealand and Uruguay. I don't know, do you know this book by Douglas North, Wallace and Weingast, Violence and Social Orders? This is a book in 2009. It was published, it was the last book of him and others. And when I read it, I found it quite ambitious. They have a sentence saying they can explain human development for the last 10,000 years. And also they say they only need two models, two ideal types, some limited access order and some open access order. I come to this later. But so I thought like it's very simple model, very simply drafted, and they want to explain everything. So I thought, okay, maybe they can explain at least a bit. I also problem I saw with this book is that I thought I have read this before. So if you read institutional economics literature, you see Mansur Olsen's book from 2000 or Samuel Huntington's book from 1968, Political Order in Changing Societies. These books are basically the same. So I was wondering why Nobel Prize winner writes the same book or similar. So there must be something different in it. And so I wanted to understand this better. I also wanted to see is how they are different in comparison to Acemoglu. Acemoglu also wrote a book with Robinson at the same time, and so I want to know what is really the interesting part of this book. So this is why I focused on the debate and North as well. And then why did I choose New Zealand and Uruguay? You must imagine there's in the general literature, you always have the saying that British economies or Anglo-American economies are the best for, or societies are best for development because they have a better legal system, they are more effective. So on the other hand, they say that the Spanish system, that all Spanish colonies are worse in comparison, that they have worse institutions, and because of this they cannot get as rich as the Anglo-American countries. But what's interesting here is that New Zealand and Uruguay is never touched by such a discussion. You always you always hear something about Argentina, Australia, all these big countries, but if you want to know something about these small countries, you don't find much evidence on this. And so I said, okay, let's compare these two countries with each other. And as well, they are very similar in size. So they have the same population, or they had the same population at this time. They have the same climate. They have the same kind of size of the agricultural land to produce. So it's like a social or a historical laboratory. So you can use them like types to compare the English against the Spanish development. And so I chose these two countries, and as well I chose them to actually, maybe by using this this theory from North, Wallace and Weingast, to actually get some new information about Uruguay and New Zealand. This brings me to the theoretical background. So far, everything's fine? Okay. So to summarize, basically their idea, what they're saying in the book, is that social institutions determine how rich the country can become. And in this book, which is new for this theory by North, Wallace and Weingast, is they say because they contain violence and they include interest groups. So what North, Wallace and Weingast do in this particular theory is they also add this Weberian dimension. So Max Weber presented this earlier, that they said you need a monopoly on violence. If the state has a monopoly on violence, you can become rich, otherwise you stay poor. So this is something quite new in Douglas North's theory. Before he didn't touch it. And he also didn't touch so much political economy, and now we're getting maybe a bit closer to your research as well, because before he was only focusing on institutions. He was only in institutions, but what a lot of other scholars criticized was that they never talked about politics, how actually politics work. And so you can see in this theory that they try to incorporate this literature as well. And I drafted a bit of a simplified scheme of how they perceive how society works. So you have, on the one hand, you have the political markets, and these are the basic fundamental institutions, and they determine how policies can work, how interest groups work with each other, what are the rules of the game, so to say. And basically, depending on these policies made by these players, you get to the outcome, or to the economic outcome. You either become rich or you stay poor. This is what they say. And they basically say that we have the open access order companies. They are flexible. They can adjust to exogenous shocks. They can have new ideas produced every time. They can incorporate other ideas. And so they stay, when you see that on the flat line going upwards, this is what New Zealand should develop in theory. And then I show you the limited access order Uruguay, which should, because of their bad institutions, they should develop less, slower and more volatile. So a recession would be deeper and maybe grow faster, but at the end they end at a lower scale of development. So this is basically the idea of their theory. They say, and you need 3 different conditions to get from limited access order to an open access order. And these 3 conditions are rule of law. Rule of law is nothing saying that you have property rights established, and more or less democracy. And second, they say you need to have stable organizations and sophisticated organizations. And last but not least, you need to have the military under civil control. So that the military is independent, but subject to political control. Yeah, and then, as I said earlier at my beginning, is they say that the contrasting institutions brought from metropolitan colonies in British North America versus Spanish America. So they say, because there were settlers coming from Britain to New Zealand, and there were Spanish settlers going, or Italian settlers going to Uruguay, they took their laws and their constitutions and their forms of institutions to these new countries established there, and that's why these 2 countries had no other way to develop as they did in the long run. So if you take this now for New Zealand and Uruguay, what I want to say is, you can maybe, that's maybe an interesting point for the discussion later on, you can take this Uruguay example for Russia, because that's what they do in their theory, saying, okay, we take one example from Uruguay, from Argentina, and say it's the same in Russia, for instance. That's what they do, and that's maybe an interesting point for discussion later on. And on the other hand, you have this comparison between England and the United States, saying you need to have open economy and market, and you need to have democracy, all this, and this you can maybe compare to New Zealand. What is interesting in their theory itself is, as I said, they use a lot of theory to explain their own perceptions. So you can find all of these different theories from Tilly, Wallerstein, Acemoglu, Weber, Schumpeter. You can use any name you can think of, and you will find this in a book. So, but the interesting case is that they say, we take this from Schumpeter or we take this from Tilly, but we add another dimension, or we refine their theory. So whether you think it's right or not, but they always have an answer for any misconceptions in the other theories. So it's quite interesting. If you take the theory of North, Wallace and Weingast, you get all of the other theories, so to say. And this is what I wanted to see, whether it's really the case. If they really have this single theory you can use for any kind of development discussion. Any questions on this? Okay. Methodology. Okay, if you read the paper, then you will not see any kind of fancy formula. So what I use is a so-called analytic narrative. It's more like a storytelling kind of thing. But what I do is I do use two different research layers. So one research layer, and you find this on the top here, is this general assessment called, where I compare just a very simple indicators like GDP on one hand and institutional sophistication, so like Polity 4 indicators on this very high level, and to see whether this argument by North, Wallace and Weingast is true in the case of New Zealand and Uruguay, or if it's already an issue. This is what they do. They always talk about these indicators. They don't talk about much more detail. They always remain on that level of analysis. The second point I do is I kind of, because of this framework, I do a kind of deduction, so I use their propositions and apply them to New Zealand and Uruguay. But on the other hand, I also try to dig deeper and get information out of the archive or other literature. And then, like, is what I call induction here, is this part is additional information, and this should give us more understanding of how the processes actually work. So it's a mix of, at the end, of quantitative and qualitative data, and it's a very, yeah, how do you say, unique framework in this sense. So, and then, as you see, then I have the second and the third level, or the second level with economic policies and economic outcomes, and there I've selected indicators which facilitate my discussion. But we can talk about this later if you want. So there's also periodization. Then you might wonder why I've chosen 1930 as a start point of my analysis, and I go to 1973. A lot of these institutional theories or studies, they don't really consider the major global changes. So you have some random periods in your studies. But because I had this global view of my paper, I followed the discussion of Perron. And Perron had a famous article in 1989 saying about what were the really most fundamental changes in world economy. And the most fundamental changes in world economy were in 1930 with the Great Depression and the changes afterwards. And then in 1970 something, the oil price shocks. So these were the two only fundamental changes in the world economy. So I used this period to actually analyze these two cases. It's also the case because in New Zealand and Uruguay we had a quite interesting development to which I come later on. And so this period fits perfectly for my purposes. But there are strengths and limitations. Of course, as I said, this theory by North, Wallace and Weingast is quite complex if you get into the details. So to get this into one paper and to attract it, talk about all the major developments, you can't do this by a simple formula. I also wanted to combine the theory and history together, and because I wrote a complete book for 150 years of development, so I can also incorporate long-term change. So I have in my first chapter I'm talking rather about agricultural market and land market development. In the second chapter more about the productivity gains from industrialization, and in the third chapter I'm talking a bit more about services, so I can have a different focus on this. Yeah, of course there are also limitations. I don't have a fancy formula for this, so as you can criticize this. I only chose these two countries and certain parts of their socio-economic development. So it's a selection bias, and of course what I say today may not be valid for other countries or other periods of time. Any questions? No, it doesn't work. Findings. So as I said at the earlier stage, at the beginning I took a really simple comparison between economic development and their political freedom, their democracy in the country. So you might wonder what does it mean. So you must imagine this dotted line at the top, that's New Zealand. That's like ideotype. New Zealand saying you are always on the left-hand scale. You see the politically for constraints data set. On the right-hand side, you see the logarithmic difference between the economic development of the two countries. So New Zealand is the ideotype. It's always at the output frontier. So it's the rich country. It's the democratic country. So New Zealand was always the most democratic country at this time. It was the richest country of the time in comparison to Uruguay. So I take this like as a scale for Uruguay. And then if you look further in the history of Uruguay, what you see is that we had a lot of changes here in the basic institutions of Uruguay. You see this by these changes here of the political for index. So you had some, if you have a value above 0, then it's a democracy. If it's 0 or below 0, it's a dictatorship. That's what the model, what the indicator says. And in the normal line here, the black one is the economic development of, or the level of output in comparison to New Zealand on per capita scale. So it's interesting to see is, what you see is you have a lot of changes here in Uruguay, and you also see that you have no change in New Zealand. It always remains at the top of the dotted line. And what's interesting now to see is what we have a steep fall here after the Great Depression. So after the Great Depression, Uruguay fell dramatically in their output, but remained comparatively stable until the 1950s. So it's interesting to see because this was a time of a dictatorship, of a mild dictatorship, not a democracy. So it remained comparatively stable in comparison to New Zealand. And even more interesting is then after 1950s, they had a change in their constitution, and they became one of the most liberal countries in the world. So New Zealand was a role model for other countries. It's called in Spanish como el Uruguay no hay, or in English you say the Switzerland of South America, because it was so at this time said a very developed country. They had a highly very well sophisticated, how to say, welfare market. They had a democracy in place, so you would say, well, they had the best option to develop, or the best fundamentals. But as you see here in this graph, they actually fell further down when they were a democracy. And then at the end, in 1973, we had a full-scale dictatorship at the end, and this lasted until 1985. But at the end, what I wanted to emphasize is here they were comparatively at the same level of output per capita at the beginning. And 40 years later, they had only 50% per capita of output. So it was a quite dramatic change. And this is maybe also interesting for your discussion later on if you think about Russia in 1990, when they changed from communist system to a democracy, and then why they didn't develop as expected, maybe except of these market reforms. So what we see is it's really contrasting to the normal thing. You say that you need a democracy to develop, but what you see here, in the formal sense, democracy didn't help Uruguay at this period of time. One thing I want to mention at this level is, it looks as New Zealand was always the perfect country from institutions and also from the economic development. New Zealand had a couple of changes at this time which didn't make it so ideal type. For instance, they eliminated one chamber of the parliament, so it had only one chamber. It's the only developed country in the world which has only one chamber, and it doesn't have a written constitution. So if you take it from a formal sense, you don't have these checks and balances as you would have set by the literature. But still it kept richer or state richer than Uruguay. So it was quite interesting for me to see this, and I wanted to understand why is this actually the case. Why did Uruguay fall to this level? And so I started to dig deeper. I think. All good? Okay. No. So I started to dig a bit deeper, and so I looked at more at the political markets. As I said, we had the institutions like constitutions as the formal rules of the games, and then how did it translate into the elections? So these elections here, what you see with these bars, these are the actual representation in the parliament. So these black and the gray scales, or black and gray bars, the actual representation, and the dots and the crosses are the election results. So what you see here when you take the gray and the black bars is that in both countries you had only two parties in the parliament. So the representation was basically the same. You had two major parties, and one party changed at one election and so on. But you didn't have like 3 or 4 parties within one parliament represented. That's quite interesting. But what's the difference here is that in New Zealand we had a British majority system, and in Uruguay you had that so-called pluralistic system. What does it mean? When you take these crosses here, these crosses are the election results of Uruguay, and the black points are that from New Zealand. If you take these black points, you see that the election results in New Zealand were quite similar to the representation in the parliament. So you don't have too much deviation between these two results. So in other words, the person who went to the ballot and gave their vote was also kind of represented in this way, or this vote was presented as they actually voted. But what we see here with these crosses is, for Uruguay is that you had a lot of different factions. You must imagine you're going to the ballot, and you have within one party you have different parts, so-called factions, and these factions are like competing against each other. And so you can have one party, but they have different factions, and every faction has a different program. And so at the end they're competing against each other within one party. But when the party at the end wins, because at the end only the party votes count, then all of these different competing ideas with one party needs to be included or have to be combined within one government. So you have a much more, how do you say, much more struggle, much more unrest within these political results than it was in Uruguay and in New Zealand. And so what happened here, that the outcome was that in New Zealand we saw stable governments, and they could continue to implement their policies and so on. But in Uruguay, because of these ongoing competitions within the parties, like political leaders, such as prime ministers or even normal ministers or head of monetary policies, they had to change their office even every 1 or 2 years. So if you have someone every 1 or 2 years changing the seat of the ministry, you don't have the time to implement a policy. So this is basically the outcome of these differences in the election system, and so they didn't have the chance to implement long-term development strategies. And yeah, another difference here, what you don't see in this graph, is that in New Zealand, the majority, or in the parliament, they were farmers. So the farmers had an extraordinary impact on policies. So in comparison to the normal saying in the literature that you need to industrialize, that people from sophisticated sectors need to be in the politics to develop a country, in New Zealand there were a lot of farmers, and they determined how to spend the money on development. And in contrast, in Uruguay, you had a lot of urban interests, so industrialists from the service sector and so on, and only very small or very small number of farmers represented. But this was rather a rural elite, so not small farmers, but really big farmers which were represented. And they, based on this power distribution I represented here, determined how these two countries developed. Questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm sorry, probably I did not listen carefully, but it's not clear what are the bars.
Yeah.
What are they in your model?
Yeah. What I call here is effective party parliament and effective party elections. What I do is, it's a Herfindahl index. Herfindahl index is a concentration measure, which you usually use in economics, and you usually use it in verse. But I use it in verse to show full numbers. So we have effective parliament and effective elections. So what I did is I calculated the election results, like the percentage of votes for each party or each faction, because they were separate in their elections. I calculated, and according to this Herfindahl index, you get a measure of concentration. And I did the same with the seat contribution in the parliament. And so you get also a measure of concentration in parliament. And if the election results would be the same for elections as for the parliament, you would have the same bars with the dots. So there would be no difference if the election results would be the same. So the dots and the crosses are the election results for the two countries, and the other ones are the bars, the results of the parliament, the seats distribution. That's good?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So how did it affect economic policy making after 1930? After 1930, we saw that the Keynesian spirit spread across the two countries. So Keynes was very popular in the 1930s, saying that the state has to have a role in the economy by managing demand you can actually control output growth. So what we see here, that the state, this is the government expenditure as percentage of GDP, that the state impact on the government grew quite a lot in both countries. You see that dotted line, this is New Zealand, and the black line is the overall spending in New Zealand. The black line is Uruguay central state spending, and the bars are the central and what's it called, providential, the overall spending of Uruguay. So what we see is I only had some data points for overall spending in Uruguay. That's why I have the bars. So what you see is that the bars are almost at the same height for some of the years in Uruguay as in New Zealand. What we see here is that actually, yes, Uruguay was something like the Switzerland of South America. They spent a lot of money on welfare and so on. So they had a very high level of state spending. This almost similar to New Zealand. But what is interesting here is are 2 points. On one hand, that the distribution in their spending was quite different. This 1 point, and also that New Zealand wasn't so federalized as imagined. So the first point what I want to mention is Uruguay had the same spending levels or similar spending levels as New Zealand, but in New Zealand, as I show later, New Zealand spent a lot on investments. So they spent money on building bridges, harbors, and so on. And in Uruguay, they spent the money actually on retirement benefits or any other things to keep people out of work. So they actually gave you money when you left work with 50 or 55 years, so that people had money to spend buying stuff produced, and to have an office open or a job open for someone younger. That's what their general policy was, to give you an example. So you had a quite different spending pattern with these two countries. And on the other hand, New Zealand, because there's a theory saying you need to have a decentralized country. You need to have a United States with 50 different provinces or states, and then each state to be independent, and then it becomes rich. But New Zealand actually, it was only one state, and all the spending what you see here, like 90% of the spending was actually decided in Wellington by the central government. So the difference here is not so much saying that was neither the level in difference in spending, nor was it that it was more decentralized in the actual decision power. The difference here between the two countries was how they spent the money. So they spent it more on investments, and the other ones more on welfare. This is what I want to show here in the next slide. What we see here is just a separation between whether you spent that money on investments or on subsidies, and whether this investments come from the state or whether they come from private persons or private entities. So the interesting case here was that we see that New Zealand had always a very high level of public spending, what you can see here in comparison to Uruguay. So the state had a high developmental role in the society. So it was not a a passive state. So what North Wallace and Weingast always say, you need to have a small state, and all the private economy has to do the job. So only the private entities know how to spend best the money, and that's what they say. So that's why they always promote the American model. But in New Zealand, as a British economy, you could see that the state was actually very influential in development. And if you compare this to the results of private gross capital formation, you see that the difference there was of course a difference in spending by these private entities, but not so much a difference, at least not until the 1950s. And then you can argument whether the spending was based on falling property rights or falling absolute wealth. But you see, until the 1950s, the private spending on capital formation was very similar, but a real difference was made in the public gross capital formation. On the right-hand side, I show you the comparison between subsidies paid to entities. And here also you only have two data points here. The third one is actually in the paper added up. You see that in New Zealand, money was spent on people, on subsidies, so to keep businesses running, inefficient business running, and instead of actually giving them the infrastructure to develop. An interesting case in this way is that, for instance, Uruguay only spent that little money on investments, but on the other hand, if you look on their general spending, they spend more than twice as much on their military. So Uruguay, if you look at a map, there's only Argentina and there's only Brazil next to it. And so there was no open conflict between those two countries, and they didn't fight overseas. So there was no conflict, international conflict, that they wouldn't have had to spend so much money on the military. So, so it's interesting to see that they had the money for the military, but not for their infrastructure. And this is also because, that I show in the paper, that they needed to employ people. So they employed people in the military to have them off the streets, but they didn't spend it on building these actual streets. So one point I want to mention here is also, as I said, the state had a very important role in New Zealand. And so in contrast to what you always read in the economic literature is, New Zealand wasn't a small government. It was actually the largest investor in the whole country. It was the largest employer. It nationalized all different sorts of sectors. So the railways were nationalized, the banks were nationalized. So during this period where we saw this prosperity in New Zealand, almost everything was controlled by the state. So and then you see in Uruguay, we had a similar discussion, but as I said, the focus was there more on consumption and not so much on investment. Questions? How did all these differences in their policy making resulted in their export strength? So the export market is usually taken as an example how competitive is a company a country internationally. So here I compared the overall output, the overall export overseas, and some concentration measures. What we see here is that New Zealand at the beginning in 1930 had about twice as much exports as Uruguay. So it was already quite different in comparison to this. But if you look then until 1968, it had actually 4 times as much of output, or even more than 4 times as much output. And Uruguay actually had less exports in this time, which is a bit strange if you would expect some kind of positive development over time. And if you look at the other measure of export strength, then you see that merchandise exports as percentage of GDP, we have twice as much in New Zealand at the beginning, and still higher in New Zealand than Uruguay at the end. At the end, New Zealand, you see that merchandise exports as percentage of GDP fell in comparison to the beginning. This was the reason behind this is that they had a so-called import substitution industrialization strategy, where they try to become more autark, to actually produce more products within the country, and but we also see what I come later in the paper, that they also missed on kind of development in the industry. So what they exported in the 1960s was basically more or less the same as in 1930. So they produced more, but they didn't produce so much different goods. And how do I show this? When you look at the export destination concentration, this is the same Herfindahl index. So you take the country where you export your goods to, and you calculate the percentage, and then you get to this concentration. So the higher this number is, the more markets you equally send your products to, which also means that you're not so dependent on one market, or that more markets are actually buying from you because you're having very competitive products. And what you see here at the beginning is that both countries had one large export market. That was at the beginning the British economy, or the Great Britain, and the other 0.41 and 0.63 were other countries. But the most important destinations for both of these countries were Britain. And then you see that the numbers are rising in both countries slightly over time. But interesting is that only in 1968 New Zealand actually got rid of this focus on one market, on the British market. Only after the Second World War they were able to export to the United States in larger quantities and other countries. So before then they both were dependent on the British economy. So if the British economy failed or had problems, both countries suffered equally. But at the end, as said, New Zealand was quite successful in having different markets, but Uruguay remained a bit dependent on Great Britain and some other countries. What they did not change considerably is that export product concentration. At export product concentration, this is also in Herfindahl index, and this is according to whether they produce pastoral products like milk, meat, and so on. If they produce agricultural products, this is like wheat, or whether they produce mining or fabricated goods like industrial goods. When you see here, both of these countries produced more or less only pastoral goods, and at the end you see that they also added some additional products to this output mix. But so to say, what you see here is on one hand we see, to summarize the slide, you see Uruguay remaining more or less the same. So Uruguay did not spend that much money on infrastructure. They couldn't export that much. Actually they exported less. They couldn't export different products, and they kept on sending these products to the same destinations. On the other hand, we see New Zealand. New Zealand, they had a stable economy or stable society. They spent a lot of money on the countryside, so they developed the ports, they developed the streets, they developed all these dairy works. So they could produce much more of these meat and so on afterwards, but they did not develop other products. So what they wanted to do at the beginning, or what they officially proposed to industrialize, but they actually never industrialized in that way. So the only strength where they come from was to send their meat to other countries in their milk. But you can see these changes here quite well in the data. And so to give you an idea what was the difference in productivity, and this should be the last slide of my findings, is how did it actually change this productivity in New Zealand. And here I give you an idea about the size of these two different economies or agricultural sectors. You see, so you have almost the same employment in the primary sector in 1966. We had almost the same size in cultivated land. So basically, if you say, take it from there, they should have the same output. But we see here that New Zealand had a lot of improvements in their pasture. So their cattle got much better soil, so they could feed better and produce much more meat than in Uruguay. In Uruguay, the countryside was just left as it is, no investment made, and so the country stayed as it was like 100 years ago, simply speaking. And how does it translate into productivity? You see that you have almost twice as much animals per hectare in New Zealand than in Uruguay at this time. You produce more than 100% more meat for 1 hectare. So you also produce almost 60%, something like this, or 70% more wool per head. So you have a sheep in New Zealand, you have a sheep in Uruguay, and you get 70% more wool out of 1 sheep there. And if you take a look at wheat yield, you also get more than twice output per hectare, kilos per hectare. So you can really tell what the impact was of these developments or the spending bias in New Zealand in comparison to Uruguay. The paper itself, I think I have skipped the industrial part, but if you want to know, it's written more in detail in the book. So this brings me to the conclusion. The conclusion, what I take from this chapter is, yeah, of course, the rules of the game, so institutions and their players, had an important impact on the economic developments in these two countries. So if you take North and Wallace and Weingast, yes, they are right, institutions matter. But what I want to emphasize is that this theory of social orders, their theory can only partially explain these development differences between New Zealand and Uruguay. So especially New Zealand is completely, or not completely, but quite different to what they describe in their theory. So it's not a federal state, it was not an open market economy, it was not a small state with a lot of private engagement, but rather it was a very centralized economy with a lot of public employment and similar levels of welfare as in Uruguay. So the more interesting results of this is that they provide a stable order, and that they actually took advantage of their natural factor endowments, and that they improved the countryside. I also want to mention is that the transitions to this open access order status took much longer. So in their book they say that open access orders developed in the 19th century, but as I showed here, that was not an open market economy, it was not a fully democratic country either. So this, what they usually say, open access, only developed in the late 20th century. What else did I have to mention? Okay, then what I want to say is that if you're talking about the state or about how to develop a country, then you also need to take the state as a development agent into account, and maybe also that formerly British economy can also maladapt to the different changes. The maladaptation I haven't talked about that much today, but it's written more in detail here in the book. So this is an argument done by Gerschenkron and Chang. So if you have this literature, then you find this argument about the state as development agent as well. And last but not least, what I want to mention is you see a lot of papers comparing normal state forms, saying that's a democracy, that's a dictatorship, and they usually take an indicator such as the Polity 4 index, or they compare whether there was an election or not. So I suggest that if you do research on certain stuff, don't look only on these formal, on these very top level formal institutions, but go more into detail, because you get the real results from there. So this is all for now. So Dankeschön, spasibo, and thank you.
So, questions?
Yeah.
Did you took in other factors like culture and religion and yeah, even the simplest the resources of these countries? Maybe New Zealand is rich resource land and
Yeah.
oil or gas or something like this,
Yeah.
so it can develop.
Yeah.
I did not understand what factors you took in exactly.
Okay. So to get back to New Zealand, Uruguay itself, they do not actually have much oil. In New Zealand they had a kind of a gold rush in the 19th century, so they had gold and they had coal, but the gold rush ended in 1870 something, and the coal wasn't that much, or it's not that much presented, and oil is a bit presented, or gas is presented in New Zealand, but it's not a huge impact factor. So you can natural resources you can basically exclude it on that side. So you can rather focus on the farmland. So in the first chapter, where I look rather at the farm side, I compare the farm sites and how they were different, and I show that they had the same size of farmland, and the quality of the soil was actually worse at the beginning in New Zealand, and they improved it to the same or better level than in Uruguay. So from that perspective, they are comparable and similar. And with regards to culture, it's a kind of a mixture in my analysis. So I focused quite a lot on formal institutions, on saying how is the constitution written, and then I go to politics and so on. The reason behind this is I didn't touch like Catholicism or something like this, because in Uruguay there was never a strong church in this, and this is quite different to other countries like Argentina. Well, Argentina as well, but if you go further north, the church had much, like in Mexico, had a much higher impact on the society. But in Uruguay, it was actually very, is a modern state in that sense, because they abolished all these alliances with the church in the early 20th century. So you can kind of rule out the church in the two countries as an impact factor, which still leaves us with the actual culture. And yes, it's not in there, but it is in my discussion, because what I show in the earlier chapter is we had these British settlers coming to New Zealand, and then the Spanish and the Italian going to Uruguay. And so what you see is that they brought their opinions, their culture to the countries. And in New Zealand especially, you see that this culture was actually used to mitigate some of these institutional flaws they have. So whenever, for instance, something changed in Great Britain, then they wanted to be as the Britons, and so they took these information from Great Britain, or they had strong cultural links, and so they followed similar tracks, even it was from cultural perspective onwards. But yeah, I agree. I only focus more on the politics based on that institution.
But this cultural factor is also a magnet, because like, well, let's take I'm a rich man, I speak English because it's the world language, so I have more, and it is my culture as well, so I have more reasons to go to New Zealand, like Uruguay. Like in this example, I think it will work as well in 1930 and so on.
Yeah, you had quite a different migration pattern. At the beginning, you had in New Zealand only the rich people coming to New Zealand because they could afford it, and but later on, from the 1870s onwards, the state actually paid for, like New Zealand itself, paid for immigration, and though they selected the kind of persons they wanted, and so they only selected persons which are healthy, who are healthy. They have a kind of education and so forth, and so they had a selection bias in this. Whereas in Uruguay, you had that difference. As well, at the beginning, only the rich people went there, and then the state also paid for selection, but the selection criteria were not so strong. They focused also on the same language, of course. They focused on Spanish or Italian. They didn't say we spend our money on having British settlers coming to our country. So that's certainly an impact, yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong. I understood that those countries who choose the country which choose the import substitution industrialization failed. Why those countries like New Zealand which choose exporting, resource exporting, are more prosperous and better in economic sense. So, is it true, or it's too simple?
Well, actually, what I show in my paper is you can call this a resource curse. That countries with a lot of resources cannot industrialize. That's what you mean?
I mean, maybe if it is true that such countries as Uruguay and countries from Latin America, which chose this ISI strategy, maybe all of them failed because this strategy is this strategy could be a curse for their politics. While such countries as New Zealand and such exception from Latin America is Chile, for example, which also exports wine, copper, and the other. I'm not sure. Maybe something else. So. And these countries are more prosperous because this strategy is better.
Okay.
Is it true? Or maybe it's...
Well, actually, I wouldn't say that import, how do you say, sorry, I forgot the word, import substitution industrialization itself was not a general failure of both countries. Because what is not here in the paper, but you find other works, if you compare New Zealand, for instance, to Denmark or Australia, They had the same import substitution industrialization period, so where they closed off of different markets or other markets and tried to industrialize. And Australia actually became much more industrialized than New Zealand, and Denmark as well. They became much more industrialized. So at the beginning they were all countries producing a lot of agricultural output, but these other countries changed to industrialized countries. But New Zealand did not, and so much, at least. So I wouldn't say that import in substitution industrialization per se is a problem.
And the question, the next question is, what is the link between this British institution and or Spanish institution and these economic strategies?
Yeah, at the beginning I showed this in the page. There we go. In comparison to Uruguay or New Zealand, when they came to, they had a fundamental break in their society in 1876, I think, where actually before there were only aristocrats in the government, and so they had like large landowners, rich people in the government. And then, but in the 1870s, they got off these. They got into this small farmer society. They had a huge change, but without any military interruptions. So this is a difference. What North and Wallace always say, and all the other literature, that the British culture is more open, that they allow other parts of the society to become powerful, to get into parliament. And so in the 1876, these small farmers became part of the government. And since the 1876, you had small farmers ruling in New Zealand. So small farmers were almost always representing large parts of the government since that. And in contrast to in Uruguay, what the literature says, the Spanish culture is always quite hierarchical. You have these large landowners or some aristocrats, and they don't let other people share their power. And that's so you had a lot of struggles here with these different constitutions to either keep them out in this out of parliament or keep them in this parliament. So you had a lot of changes here, whereas in New Zealand we had a stable development. And so this is what they usually say in there, and you find these differences in this comparison. So and because of these struggles, because like many people did not get access to politics. For instance, you had then this change to a dictatorship because people wanted to get into politics, wanted to actually change their lives to a better thing, but the large landowners and the urban elites in Uruguay, then at the end of 1973, didn't want to have them in, and so they established a dictatorship to keep them out. And this is a difference in the British and the Spanish system, according to the scholars, and what I also found out here.
Did I understand you correctly that actually their economic system depends on their institutions and their development? I mean that you said now that there are changes in their institutional development in New Zealand and Uruguay basically created their idea of their way how to develop economy in the country.
Yeah.
So could I say that economy is just a dependent variable in your research or not?
Yeah, I took it more as a dependent variable. In this case, of course, you can say that the economy feeds back to politics. Of course, if there's a change in factors or something, did I have it? You can also say that the economy feeds back to politics and changes maybe the distribution of. But I took it from there saying what North and Weingast say, that the social environment of social environment determines whether you get rich or stay poor. So if you take this as a kind of a trial, if you take the British settlers and you would have taken them to Uruguay with their institutions, then Uruguay would be now rich. And if you take the Spanish settlers to New Zealand, then New Zealand would be poorer by now. So yeah, take this as a dependent variable.
So I didn't understand you correctly that actually institutions are also do not play the real role in your model. They're just their heritage of their culture and just of their social order. Yeah, that's absolutely well. That comes from the theory, but for me, it's not actually really clear how it's possible to change. Because if you have the idea that it works that way, and if you just switch the people from the countries, nothing could be changed. So actually, for me, it seems to be like, for what reason you do have to make a research if you have their idea that nothing could change, it just could follow, or you have kind of variables which could also have an influence, or it's just a direct development which goes and could not be changed.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is a path dependency literature, and saying this that you cannot change anything at all. That's true, but this is a kind of thing where both Wallace and Weingast and also myself are a bit not 100% conclusive, or a bit taking it a bit strangely in this way. What they did in the first or the book before this, they said culture is the most important role. So if the culture says they have a passage in in his 2005 book, if he has an Islamic country will never become rich. So this was then shown by many other people or scholars. That's actually not the case. And this is basically also the argument by Weber that you can also take with Catholicism and like the role of religion. So what they did in this book, they changed to much more formal view. They changed to formal institutions, so on constitutions, on the parliament, on votes, and so on. Because of this criticism, they said, okay, that we cannot uphold this cultural path dependence anymore, but they still keep this somewhere in their theory. So they don't say cultural is the most important thing, but they keep it in the theory. And what I wanted to show is I also focused on formal institutions, and I think this is. They are, for myself, they're the most important factors, formal institutions. If they change it, but the formal institutions must fit to the informal institutions. So you cannot take, the parliamentary system in the UK or in New Zealand and just transplant it right into Uruguay. So if you do that, you could easily do this, but people would need at least time to adjust. So you cannot do it from one point to the other. And so you have this mixture between informal and formal institutions. And what I wanted to show here is in my paper, I showed some examples of how these formal institutions, for instance, changed in one country and the other, and they actually had, in both countries, they had really bad public services in the 1930s, like say not a professional public service. So if you wanted to get a job with the state, in both countries you need to have personal connections at the beginning of the 20th century. But in New Zealand, they actually changed these formal requirements and said you need to have formal educations, you need to prove your education and so on. So they developed impersonal institutions, and so that the public administration became professional in New Zealand, but it didn't become professional in Uruguay. So this is what I wanted to show, an example where you actually have formal institutions and step by step you develop them to other level. You do not stick with your cultural heritage.
I also want to add one, maybe two questions. I also want to trace how can we trace this British heritage to which institutions does it came to this prosperity? So, what are these informal institutions? What are the concrete examples of these formal institutions, informal institutions, which we can find in New Zealand, or maybe in Uruguay, which are not in New Zealand.
Okay. Well, regarding the formal institutions, they got the same court system as in the UK. They got at the beginning the same parliamentary system, so that the whole rights and laws, an exact copy of the British system. When they took it from, it was just a copy from Great Britain, and in Spain, in Uruguay, you saw actually constitution written by these landlords there in the 1830s. So they came from Spain or Italy, and they wrote their own version to actually come in. So you had not 100% copy, but the people took their ideas of how to structure a constitution or the right system to this. And when it comes to informal institutions, I didn't touch it that much, but I can give you an idea. Is they wanted they wanted to, for instance, to be always better Britons. That's what they said. So they established a tea time at 5 o'clock in New Zealand. They took the birthday of the Queen and made it a public holiday. So they tried to be as British as possible, and this British at this time, what they developed was they wanted to have some equality. So there was a lot of fights in this colony at the beginning in New Zealand, fights saying we need to have equality within the society. We want to be an equal society. This is what they discussed at this time. And in Uruguay, you did not see this discussion at this point. You didn't have this formation of having an equal society. So if, for instance, people arrived in Montevideo, and first went to the rural countryside. But the rural countryside, the large landowners sent them away again, sent them off. So the only chance for them to settle was then in Montevideo again. So they actually went back again and remained within that city. So that's why Montevideo is such a huge city for the size of the country, and they didn't settle there because the landowners did not provide any means to let them settle there. So it was a quite different cultural concept in this way.
And the last one.
Okay.
Today we speak about Uruguay as a bad example, as a loser, as about loser, but it's quite unusual because previously when I had something about Uruguay, that was the champion of Latin America, maybe as Costa Rica and Chile. And my question is, why Uruguay is better than other Latin American countries in some ways, in prosperity, in different economic items. What can you what can you say through your theory?
Okay. What I first said about factor endowments to his question was that factor endowments do not explain the differences between the two countries. So New Zealand and Uruguay, the difference in the prosperity cannot be explained because New Zealand had more land or whatever, or more coal or whatsoever. But what I do actually think is that these factor endowments actually paid for the prosperity in Uruguay. So because it was once one of the richest country in the world of capital stock, because you must imagine they had I think the highest population of cattle in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. So they had quite a rich country just by its nature.
Uruguay?
Uruguay, yeah. So without doing nothing, so just having this cattle on open grass, they could send them off to Britain because Britain needed proteins, and for the industrialization or industrializing society. So Uruguay could, because of these factor endowments, earn a lot of money, and this money paid for the welfare state, and so this money could be taken to actually have retirement benefits, to have social insurance, and so on. So I do think that factor endowments are important in a way that they paid for this, but it does not explain the difference between New Zealand and Uruguay.
Okay. Yeah. The second round.
Oh, sorry. At the beginning of the lecture, you said that you could compare in some cases Russia and the countries you talked before, but if we keep in mind their heritage of the country, I just could not understand their reason for comparison, because which time did you try to compare? You did not say that it's a model or something, but you just asked about the possibility for comparison. And is it possible, the question is it possible to compare it, or if there is a necessity to create a kind of model for their post-Soviet countries, which are having kind of a specific model, and which have own way, and if yes, how should it work, and what is their future? I mean, how it's possible to compare the communist model in case there is nothing similar?
Yeah. It's a very good question. I'm actually not an expert in any Russian economic history, but I take it from the parts what I studied so far is, and this is what North, Wallace and Weingast say in their theory, that you have only natural states and you have open access countries. And so in their saying, Russia and Uruguay would remain natural states. They have issues that they cannot develop. That's what they say without any judgment. That's just what they say. And they would need to fundamentally change society and the power distribution to become an open access order, to become something like the US or the UK. That's what they say. They have these two models or these two ideal types, and saying within this one you could say that Uruguay has similar fundamental institutions or fundamental workings as Uruguay, as Russia. Sorry. So this is what they say. This is what I actually wanted to share or discuss with you. To whether that's true or not, because there was another book coming up in 2013 by North Wallace and Weingast. It's called In the Shadow of Violence, and in this book they have a lot of different how do you call this, studies on different countries. Like and there they say, okay, we apply this model of limited access orders to these different countries, and we see that we get the same results. That they have elites not sharing power, that they focusing only on certain parts of the economy to extract rents, but they do not foster economic developments. That's what they say. And getting back to what I know of that Russian literature, is that we had a lot of development agencies here coming in 1990s, I think, or 1991, and saying we have this Washington consensus, you need to have open markets, you need to have democracy and so on, you need to privatize everything, and if you privatize everything, you will get rich. And then there was a lot of literature developing from this one, saying why did Russia develop as it developed after 1990? Why didn't it become as rich as expected afterwards? And so what I wanted to say here is there's this literature saying that they're talking about this change from communism to market economy in 1990s, and there was a lot of literature going on. And here's the same with Uruguay. They had a market economy, or they had a dictatorship at some point, and they went to democracy, but they always kept on being a market economy. So they had these changes in their social model. But well, so it would be interesting for me to see what are your ideas regarding now the change from communism to democracy, or to this market economy. So this is actually my question to you.
I cannot give an answer.
Okay.
Maybe to all of us.
Or to all of you.
But
Maybe.
it's just the question again. Their time of their dictatorship in Uruguay was rather less than their dictatorship in Soviet Union, and actually their model of state looked different. And also back to their cultural aspect of the theory. I mean, you did not mention their cultural aspects. But I think that the Catholic Church played a huge role in Uruguay instead of their church in Soviet Union, because there was no fightings against the church, and the church was not persecuted in Latin America dictatorship regimes. That's why I think this point is quite important for making research and comparison. Comparison of Uruguay and Russia, because the cultural aspect reminds me something from Engelhardt's theory and his outliers, and the outliers he found, they're Latin America and ex-Soviet states. He was explaining it for their idea of their religion also. That's why I think the cultural aspect plays a huge role in the creating their idea of comparison.
Sure, definitely. I mean, if you can pass me some of the literature or some links, would be great to have a look at this, if they are in English. So, no, definitely, thanks. Just one minor thing. It was an addition to your question. Uruguay was always seen, or is always seen, as a quite progressive state. So if you read the literature, they're saying it was a democratic country. They had the welfare system and so on. But and also they they had a democracy and so on. But what is actually interesting is in the early 20th century, it was 1906 or something, or 1904. Need to look it up. This famous president came to Ordonez, his name, came to New Zealand. He's like the hero. I'm not saying comparing it to Lenin, but it's that person in Uruguay, and this president is taken always as an example of that fast and rapid development in Uruguay. And what he did is he actually really curtailed down the influence of the church. So in what they did is they got rid of all political relations or official relations with the Catholic Church in Uruguay. They actually renamed Catholic holidays to some other names, to some civil names, so to say. So the Catholic Church is completely out of scope. You can take completely as this important factor in Uruguay. And on the other hand, with regards to what he achieved in Ordonez, is yes, he established it kind of beginning of the welfare state. That's what he is known for, and he also established first democracy. But he did not change the actual working of the system. As I said, in New Zealand, you had this one-time shift to the small farmers, where the small farmers took possession of the land in New Zealand. And Ordonez, he never changed that model of having these huge farms in the hinterland and these poor people living in the city. He never tried to actually change the system to having the people sitting in the countryside and to produce more output. That's what he never did, and he also did not develop the hinterland. So this is what is always quite famous to say that he did all these changes, but actually his influence on the society was not as much as said.
So maybe it's the time to say thank you.
Thank you. What's the fear in me? Sorry.